Hello there, this is Ben with Studio on the Lake. Hey, here's another Santa. This is a Gnome Santa that I was working on, and there was 2 points to this. It's going to be 2 parts. You're going to see me do his hands with this really intricate scroll, and then the other hand's going to have a bag in it. So, and it doesn't quite go this far in this video because I switched over to little power carving. So, been a lot of discussion about basswood. Basswood is, as far as I can tell, the same as linden wood. If you see a street that says linden, it will typically be basswood. Just like other species of trees, there are several different ones. There's a northern and a southern basswood, and we'll talk about the hardness as I go through. So here's a piece that I cut out to do this piece, and most of this video, or all this video, I guess, is going to be done with a knife, and you don't normally see me do a lot of knife work, and I'll talk about why I'm doing that. And then in the second portion of it, as I got closer to the end, I went ahead and switched over to give you a contrast to the power carving. So the grain in this was oriented straight up and down in the block, and I kind of demonstrate that. So if you want to split a piece of firewood, obviously you know how that splits. Well, here's a piece of cedar to show you what grain does if you're new to carving. If you're not new to carving, you know what grain does. That grain is not straight. That's a piece of cedar. That's some of the cedar that I use to start the fire in the wood stove, and it readily splits down on the end. So if you're going to carve this, carving straight across the grain, because that grain is sticking straight up. If you take a broom and stand it on the end, the bristles of the broom are straight up, and that's the hardest to cut. You'll notice wasn't even cutting straight across that. I was kind of cutting at an angle. Now I'm shearing, and now I'm splitting. So as I try to go this way, it won't cut in the grain, and that's an exaggeration, and cedar's really good for showing that because it has predominant grain that wants to split. So here's a technique. I put a stop cut in there, and I split that piece off. Now I'm using stop cuts in that, and we're going to talk a little bit about the different cuts with a knife, and you'll get my obnoxious opinion, like other carvers, on what knife strokes and all the rest of that stuff are as we go. But cedar readily carves easy. It's used for fishing lures. Has a tendency not to rot as readily as other woods, but you see how easy that is to carve. So here's a piece of probably C or D grade. I don't even know if these grades are accurate. A, B, C, D. A being the best as always, and D being the worst. And it depends on what you plan on doing with it. There's a branch or a knot that went through that piece, and I'm going to carve the block that I cut off the top there. So there's another branch on the left side, but here's that one branch. You see it comes through this side, ends up down in there. That would be a pain in the butt to carve. That grain is going every which direction, and it's harder. That's the reason we try to leave branches out. Now, an A-grade piece of basswood might have little pinhole branches in it, but certainly not one like this. This one runs kind of through it. You can see the tree grew up around the branch, and that's going to be really hard. And then you see the outer portion where the bark came off there. Other than that, now this basswood was particularly hard. I grabbed the second piece there to see if I could find one that was a little bit softer to carve with a knife, and we'll talk about that a little bit, because the last video I put out, a lot of people were asking questions on how do you get a soft piece of basswood, and we'll go into that, how you can get closer. But this one's pretty hard, all things considered. So I decided to do a Gnome Santa, and right up front I messed it up. So I put the ball on the top of his hat in there, and this is going to be a little short guy in 2/3, and this is my design process. And as you've seen a lot of times before, there is not really a design process. I've got this guy in my head. He's not going to have eyes. He's going to have a nose, and I thought I didn't leave enough room. If I wanted to put the face in there that I wanted to, he was going to be too short. And he's going to be short anyway, just by the very nature of being a Gnome Santa, or at least what I think a Gnome Santa ought to look like. So now I moved his hat up, moved his nose up, and what I'm intending to do here, there's his beard. I'm going to touch the ground. Not going to have feet. He will have hands. And the robe will just kind of come down to the floor there. And then those portions that I just circled will be cut out. So there's my design process. You can see it's already a gnome, ready to go. All I got to do is remove all the stuff that doesn't look like a gnome. So that's pretty simple. I'm going to go ahead and quickly put on I'm going to take this over to the bandsaw. So there's where the cap, if the 2 points left and right were to meet, you got a front and a side view pattern. I'm going to leave the front there. You see me looking at it to see if I want to take any off. I don't. I want to carve all that down because the highest point is going to be his nose and the tip of his cap, obviously. So there he came out of the bandsaw. That's what I did. You heard me ramble about bandsaws on the last one. If you got a bandsaw, go cut it out. If you don't, use a coping saw. If you want to be a purist, take your knife and take that block completely down. But I've got a bandsaw, and I'll do it now. You've seen me use the DeWalt grinder, and I won't this time. But that's when I would take that DeWalt grinder and round those edges off and get him closer to where I want to carve. Because trust me, there's 3 or 4 hours in this guy, and I don't need any more pleasure working that wood down with a knife, taking small pieces off of it. I can get just as much pleasure detailing him as I do slicing chunks off him. So initially, here's the intent of this whole thing. I wanted to show you some different knife cuts. That's kind of a V cut that I'm doing down in there. And each of those V cuts, to some degree, is a stop cut. So the grain is running straight up and down on this guy. And there's a good example. So I'm cutting across the end grain right there, which is some of the hardest to do. It's easy to come down, but the side there and take pieces off because it readily wants to cut in that direction. It either wants to split if you're going down into the grain, or you're slicing across. Right there, I'm slicing across the vertical grain, and that's where you get those pretty curly chips that fly off. You'll notice I'm doing kind of a lever cut with my my thumb. And let's talk about knife cuts. For some reason, people want to name a particular action or a particular cut. I don't know if it goes back to teaching or what. And I don't disagree. Somehow you have to define what you're doing. But to me, there's only 2 or 3, maybe 4 cuts that you can really name. You got a slicing cut, a paring cut like you're running a potato. You've got a stabbing cut, and then you've got a stop cut. The rest of them are all some variation of that. That's a diamond hone. If you watch Doug Leaker, he claims he doesn't use any sharpening stuff, and he just uses honing. And here's a strop that's set up for chisels and various things, and that's rouge that I put on there. Now, one thing you'll develop as you go along, your own technique and what works for you in sharpening. That's a Ramelson bench knife. It's my favorite shape and style of knife, and this is the one that I've been using for quite a while, along with a couple of ones that I've made. So you'll notice that I'll do 20 strokes on one side, 10 on the other, and then 18 strokes on one side, 8 on the other. I tend to sharpen it to one side to a degree. I don't sharpen it symmetrically, and that's just what I've developed over the years, and it seems to work for me. But you can get into knife sharpening videos, and I'll probably do one of these days among the many others. There, I'm cutting down into the grain. See how that didn't work? That wanted to split, but here I'm just slicing it like peeling a potato, and I'm using my thumb to lever that. I'm also keeping my non-carving hand, my left hand, out of the way, and I always have something in front of that knife other than my hand or my fingers. And I am carving, obviously holding that in my lap. So beginner carvers, here we go. Now this guy would end up square, and this is my guess if you're a beginner carver. He's going to end up quite square and quite blocky. And the reason for that is you're afraid to take too much off. Some of us carvers that have been carving around for a while, I got to admit, will ruin a piece because we take too much off of it too soon, and then we can't get the symmetry in the piece. So I'm just kind of laying his hat out there with the intent of getting to his face, because his face is really the whole thing. Now that part right there is showing you how hard that wood is. You see those little steps on there? That's each time I pushed, and I'm really pushing hard on this thing, because this basswood is as hard as can be. And that comes off easy because relatively I'm splitting that corner off. I'm cutting up on a normal slicing cut, and then when I get to the bottom there, it will want to split off if I were to do that corner underneath my thumb there. So, how do you find a piece of basswood that is soft? There is some discussion. I have lived all over the world. I've taught down at Fort Rucker and younger in my military career. I spent several years down there as a flight instructor, and I carved the wood that was available. Well, the wood that's typically available and cheaper is the wood that is local. So I've carved Tupelo. It's very nice to carve. It's very expensive. It power carves beautifully, although it's lesser known among the caricature carvers and the chip carvers, that sort of thing. The classic carving wood was in Europe. If you go to Riemann, Tillman Schneider, and some of the classical carvers that did the church carvings primarily, there's some beautiful stuff if you search old world wood carvers and what they did. They worked with, depending upon where they were at, primarily Germany and England. They worked with linden, lime, spelled like lime, L-I-M-E, which is the same, and in German it's pronounced lime, but it's basswood. If you go down to Oberammergau, which is a big carving center in southern Germany, classically trained carvers, 50 or 60 wood carving shops, and they do specialize primarily in religious figures, but that wood is all basswood, also called, again, lime, linden, and that sort of stuff. So there are people that will disagree with you and say it's a completely different thing. And once again, different trees in the close family or genus or species or whatever the hell have slightly different names. But by and large, basswood, linden, lime, or lime, as some people would say, since you don't know the German pronunciation, are the same. It's not a lime tree that they're talking about, the fruit one. So, hard and soft. There is a general consensus that wood grown in the South is harder than northern basswood. So, and I don't. There's not a whole lot of basswood out on the West Coast. There is on the East Coast and the Midwest, at least from what I can see. Like I said, you'll have a whole street, and you'll have oak, pine, whatever, and then you'll have linden street. Linden is going to be filled with basswood trees on that particular street. And that's what you're looking for if you're in my bank. You're looking for someone that puts on Craigslist, basswood tree, cut down in our yard or fell down, free for firewood. That's when I pull out the truck and the trailer and the chainsaws, and I go and get those. The last group I did was 7 trees that are fairly large, and that's probably the 3rd major round of wood. So I've got enough carving wood that should last me for quite a while. hardness. We were talking about hardness. So they say that the southern basswood grows quicker. Makes sense. That's where a lot of our lumber comes from. And therefore the growth rings are further apart. Well, if you start carving, you'll notice a growth ring is harder than the wood in between. And just as an example, if you watch Jordy Johnson and when he burns a piece, you'll notice that the wood in between the rings tends to burn out a little bit quicker, and then he comes back over with his flap sander and takes away the charred wood. He ends up with little ridges and troughs, the harder wood being the rings. Well, the same thing if you're carving this stuff with a knife or even power carving. You'll notice here, I've talked about it before, I wasn't paying attention, and it's cold in the studio. It's in the mid-20s here. I left that camera lens and the camera set up, and after, an hour, I decided it was going to warm up, and it starts to fog over. It fogs over on the inside of the lens, and I keep a second lens sitting off to the side just for when that happens. But I really didn't notice this as it was going. I set it up, I carve at a distance, and I just kept going. I didn't look up at the camera. My camera has a little view screen that sits off on the side, flips out, and every once in a while I'll glance up there to make sure that I'm in frame. I'm getting fairly good at keeping it in frame. This is actually shot a little wider angle. That wider angle being that would show everything pretty much but my face, and then I zoom it and edit it down. So right now I'm cutting out his nose, and I'm just taking kind of, lack of better reference, V-cuts around his nose. And like I said, this stuff is hard as a rock. And so the southern basswood is supposed to be harder, and logically that doesn't make sense. But those rings, you'll hit a soft portion, and the knife is cutting nice, and then it hits a ring and it stops. It wants to stop. It takes a little more pressure. And then you'll get soft again and want to stop. So northern basswood grows slower. The growth rings are closer together, and the wood is more consistent. I don't know that it's necessarily softer, but the growth rings are closer together, and the push or the cut or pressure you need to go through that with a knife is consistent. It's not starting and stopping. And you get a hardness throughout the whole thing. Now, they do say, and I don't know that I necessarily agree with this, doesn't make sense with me, that kiln dried is softer than air dried. And that just doesn't make sense. Dry is dry, right? I don't know. Mine is all air dried, and it's air dried for probably 2 or 3 years. I dry it out in the shed in a quarter, like take a 2-foot round log, cut it into 4 pieces, split it into 4 pieces, and then let it dry. Well, wood dries an inch or 2 a year, so they say, in thickness, and it sits out in the shed, air drying. The shed has some ventilation. Look, see, there's where I finally realized that, hey, this thing isn't doing it. And there's the difference with the new camera lens. It's amazing. It's a miracle, modern technology. So I'm setting out his mustache in there, and you'll notice I didn't try to carve a lot of parts of that down to make that completely round. I work at it as a whole piece, not trying to finish any one section at any one time. So back to this ramble on hardness. The northern basswood, so in theory, southern basswood, air dried, would be the hardest to carve. And that seems to be the consensus. I don't remember, actually. I carved whatever wood I had available. I will tell you, if you get a piece of oak or elm or maple, and then get a piece of basswood, you don't really care how hard that basswood is versus how hard that oak is. And really what it comes down to is, if the wood is hard, you end up taking smaller cuts on it. if the wood is softer, you can hog out larger pieces. And it's taken quite a bit of pressure on this guy, because he's, you can see that I'm actually having to work to get that stab cut or stop cut in there. And that's what I did, was I outlined his beard, and there's a stab cut right there, for lack of better reference. So I did that outline, and now I'm taking that wood out beside that. Just gonna, but there's the easy way to do it: small liner cuts or stop cuts. If it's hard, you do smaller pieces out of there. And see how that nose split off up in the corner? So he's not quite as round as that nose as I was leaving it. Now I'll adjust that accordingly. You will see me stop and strop that knife on occasion. They do get worn down. So I carve the wood primarily nowadays with the power tools, and it's not necessarily that big a deal as far as the hardness. Now, if you're a pure knife carver doing figurines, it's imperative that you get the softest wood you can get a hold of, the clearest wood, and you'll enjoy life a lot better. Now, they consider that grade A or a high grade basswood will have no knots in it. It will be very clear and straight grain, no funky grain. If you remember, that piece of cedar had kind of a twist in it. It's not like you're building something out of it. You want to take advantage of that natural bend in the tree to get a beam that goes over your door perfectly. The strength is in the grain running up and down the piece, or through the length of the piece, for lack of better reference. And if you're using chip carving, you want a perfectly clear piece. Southern basswood has a tendency to have an orange or brown tint to it. It's a little bit darker, and I don't know why. So you could identify it by that way. You can identify it by larger growth rings cutting across the tip of the trunk of the tree. Northern basswood has a tendency to be more of a blonde or almost a clear. As you can see, these are pretty clear. You saw that limb in this piece earlier, and that limb is representative of what southern basswood typically looks like. So I told you where you can get it. You can buy basswood from several different suppliers. It's not cheap. They'll tell you it's $2 a board foot, which in the wood world is cheap. But then you turn around and you get a 2x2x8 blank, and that's $10. You start getting into the larger pieces, they're not going to be dry. I used to buy basswood up in New York, and here's a place where you can come get them. There was a mill, I call it a mill. It was a production facility that had wood, every species of wood. They built staircases, custom cabinets, and that sort of thing. And as a result, they had beside the mill a lumber yard. They would bring in 10 or 15 foot long pieces of basswood that were 16 quarter. And for those of you that haven't played around with wood measurements, a quarter is basically a quarter of an inch. So 4/4 or 4/4, the fraction, is a 1 inch piece of wood. So 16, do the basic math, it's a 4 inch piece of wood. And sometimes they would even have 20, which would be 5 inches thick. So this thing would be anywhere from 8 to 10 inches typically wide, and 4 to 5 inches thick, and like I said, 10, 20 feet long. I would take the pickup and I would buy I don't remember, probably $3 a board foot, a pickup load of wood. That's when I had the wood carving shop, and it was hit and miss. You would get it was northern basswood, and they used it for cabinets, and they milled it down. That's why they had such large chunks. The neat part about that lumber store, and a lot of lumber stores are like that, or mills that you go to, You go get your basswood or sugar pine in the East if you're using that as good carving wood, and you're going to pay. It's going to cost you. You're going to have to get your credit card or checkbook out. It's going to cost you $300 or $400 to get any amount of wood. But in the corner they'll have end runs and runoffs from stuff they did in the mill, and they had exotic, strange woods. Just a section there with a price tag on it. I would grab one or two of those just to see what they came up with some real funny wood like babinga and things like that. Moral of the story is try to carve everything you got. Carve what you've got local, and if you run across a supplier or a tree that happens to have soft properties, go for it. You're lucky. Now, moisture content has a lot to do with the hardness on this too. Air dried doesn't get quite down as far as kiln dried. You don't want me on my soapbox talking about moisture content. It needs to be relatively dry to be stable. But you can carve a completely wet piece, and you'll enjoy that in a lot of woods. Actually, like gum wood, hard. After it's dried, you can't carve it. It's hard as a rock. But wet, it slices kind of like butter. And the only problem being, then you have to deal with the wood when it shrinks. It's going to check and crack and that sort of stuff. Now, a lot of people will carve and only carve wet wood. And then when they're done with it, they put it in a solution called PEG, P-E-G. And they put the whole thing in there. If it's big, you'll need a 5-gallon drum. But they put it in there, and I don't know however long you leave it. The PEG solution replaces the water in the wood, and the thing won't crack at that point. Now, in Germany, you'll see a tree-sized figure of one of the apostles or something up on an altar, carved in lime or linden wood, and you go around the back, and it's obvious they carved him out of a log that was 6 foot tall, 2 or 3 foot across. The back they hollowed out, so it looked kind of like a canoe in the backside, because the front side is all they're interested in, and they don't want the features on the front to crack. You can do that. As far as wood shrinkage, that's a whole science in and of itself. If I were to make a circle of any, say an inch thick, 3-inch circle, 2 years from now, it's not a circle anymore. The way that it's shrunk, it will turn into some degree of an oval, depending on how wet the wood was when I started. And consequently, if I were to make a round snowball, since the snowballs are the theme with Jordy and Just Carve Rob over there, that snowball would be perfectly round when I carved it, and then 2 years from now, it wouldn't be. It would be more of an oval shaped operation. So this guy, you can see how I'm kind of working him down. And as hard as this wood is, you can see that a lot of effort being taken on that there to get that depth down in there. Now I'm being really careful because the part that's going to break off is the tip of his mustache under my thumb there. If I mess around with that knife, it's going to want to come right off of there. And now I don't have that particular piece that I can carve down to, because it wants to split off as you get further into the piece. If you're a beginning carver, I would suggest that you probably get a carving glove. They have some pretty nice gloves out there now. They've got various different meshes in there that don't allow you to slice your hand. Secondary to that, you've heard this before, a sharp knife is not as dangerous as a dull knife. Soft wood is not as dangerous to carve as a hard wood, and it has to do with the pressure and the levering that you're doing. So if the knife is sharp, it does what you want it to do, and you don't have to overextend yourself in the cuts. And you can do all of this with a knife. I've said it before, don't use a pocket knife. The reason you don't use a pocket knife is it will collapse. It doesn't have, unless it has a lock on it, it will collapse on your hand. A lot of people use Sloyd knives. It's a Swedish knife that the Swedes use for years. It'll be anywhere from 2 inches to 4 inches long. I'm not that fond of them because the blade is thicker and harder to push through the wood, and it's just too much. You can see that little, I don't know, what is it, an inch, inch and a half is enough to do what I want to do. Knife carving is not as quick, obviously, as power carving, and we'll talk about power carving more in the other one as I get towards the end of this. I've started, but I haven't finished the carving, and therefore I haven't finished the filming. I will finish this guy with power carving just to show you the difference. A knife is leaving, as you can see on the front of the up on his hat there, it's leaving nice shiny planes. Character carvers, part of the character carving is a result of the way a knife works. You exaggerate a cheek and you square it out, and it has little facets in it that play off the light, and therefore you're working. It's like building with a set of blocks of different sizes. And a lot of character carvers, you'll see a lot of this stuff looks the same, and you'll get different carvers with a couple different signature styles, but by and large you can tell a character carving. Cartoony, shoulders hunched over, hands in the pockets, that sort of thing. I don't do character carving particularly, and that's not cutting it down. There's some wonderful character work out there. And really the bottom line of this stuff is you're carving for yourself primarily, and it doesn't hurt if other people like it. I've noticed on the likability, a piece that I don't care for at all when I'm done, other people think is great, and a piece that I really like when I'm done carving it, no one likes it. So they don't have the same taste, and perhaps don't see the same thing that that I see in the piece. I do get a kick out of it is art. It's an art form. I wouldn't say you're a craftsman. You have a craftsman's legacy on there, and he always asks the knuckleheads, hey, do you think you're a craftsman or do you think you're an artist? And people pick one or the other. To me, a craftsman is the guy who comes in and does the stonework around your house or builds you a fountain out front. That sort of thing. It's a craft, and they're putting it together. An artist does something a little different. You can see where the line blurs there, but I wouldn't say that this is craft work necessarily. Beading, putting beads together is craft work, and there's quite a following for that. I'm fine with that, but to me it's not necessarily art. Now if you do a mosaic out of various different materials, that may cross into art. And here's an interesting note. I have two kids out of 4 that are classically trained in art, and it's fun to listen to them mess around with commercial sort of things. So one guy makes a statue and manages to sell it to the city for $100,000, while another guy is doing beautiful paintings and is lucky if he can get $10 a piece for them at a fair. So like they'll pick on, I enjoy watching Bob Ross. I don't think I would buy any of his paintings, but I enjoy watching him. And classically trained artist poo-poo Bob Ross, but here's what they forget. Bob Ross started painting because he wanted to. Somebody obviously liked his stuff, and they were interested in how to do that. They wanted to do it, and that's what we're doing here in the carving world. Me, Jordy Johnson, just carve raw. I can carve sticks and stones, you name them over there, and then young Calvin up there, and Calvin can carve. We're carving because we enjoy it, and then we want to put information out there so other people can figure out how to do it. So it's not a contest to see who's the best carver and who can come up with the most unique pieces. There is an element of that in there. We have fun. But by and large, we're trying to teach you guys how to carve, or just provide some kind of entertainment. Let's face it, it's fun to watch something develop. I get a kick out of watching people as they're going and talk to myself, oh man, it's a better way to do that. You could have done that easier. And then watch when 5 minutes later they finally figure that out. So it's all the process. So this guy is relatively square right now. I still haven't cut him back and all the pieces back. I'm working on the features. And this is about as close to real time as you can get. I think this is probably a 40-minute video, and probably twice that time. There's probably 2 or 3 hours in this guy to get to here. Now, with the power carving, I could have been to this point in 15 minutes probably. And it doesn't take as much effort. If I'm carving by myself and I have no intention of filming it and doing something, I a lot of times will pick up a knife or the chisel sets, or work with the chisels that hang on the side of the bench over there. You haven't seen me do a lot of work with the chisels, and I have to do that one of these days. But if I'm just wasting 5 hours in the morning sitting out in the studio drinking coffee, TV mindless in the background, stove going, I will use a knife just because it's nice and slow and relaxing. I carve because it's something that is relaxing to do. Now, what you're seeing is I'll work on one side of this guy and take a couple cuts off. There I'm kind of defining the cheeks. And then I'll go to the other side and do the same thing, and I get symmetry that way. And I'm never quite finishing the one before I go to the other. So there's a stop cut, for lack of better reference, or a V cut. Now I'm going to take the V and cut out of that. But basically what I did was I outlined his beard. And there's a stab cut, if you got to have a name for it. You see my thumb in there. It looks like I'm going to pull down and catch my thumb. I'm not. That thumb is a reference point, and my hand stops squeezing. You never want to get to the point where your whole hand and elbow is pushing that knife to a point out in space. That's not to say classical whittling, grab a piece of stick like a cane and push the knife away from you and let it end up in space. That can also be done, but you don't want to you would never put your hand on the opposite side, on the far side of that knife. But when I'm squeezing, if you imagine that you're squeezing your hand, thumb and finger together, at some point you can stop. And if you find that you're pushing or squeezing way too hard and overexerting, now you no longer have the safety factor in that. So I've kind of rambled on a little bit about the nice usage. There'll be a second one of these, and you'll see me finish this guy. It all started with the Santa, obviously, and this guy was power carved. And then it went into the second one, which didn't film very well. actually, which was the wizard gnome. This is a classical Santa in basswood and painted, of course. And then we went into this guy right here, who I actually like more as he goes along. Kind of a wizard turned into a Santa, more of on the evil character line. And I guess this one filmed a little better than the video itself. And then now we're working on this gnome guy, and I'm going to try to get you one more, and that'll be an old world Santa. And he's a little more. There he is, a little further along, and you didn't get to see some of this. That's after I switched to the power carving. He'll get a scroll and his naughty nice list in his left or right hand, and so as always, this has been Ben with Stu on the Lake. Like, subscribe, and comment.